All right, today we're going to be talking about responsive web design. And what do I mean by responsive web design? This is something that has especially become important as a website can be viewed by a variety of different devices. I'm sure we've all seen people that have gigantic monitors. And the web page should look good on that. But the web page should also look good on a small phone. So it's sort of a challenge to make sure that a web page looks good under both those circumstances. And that's exactly what responsive design means. So I think a pretty good example of responsive web design is Loring Community College's website. Here we are with the browser with it open completely. And as you notice, this looks pretty good. We have 4 links going across. We have a couple of stories here. We have events, and we have in the news in 2 columns. And we have this down there. Now, as we get smaller, things get a little tighter. Notice the image gets smaller. This image here. It gets smaller. At a certain point, what used to be 2 columns, or 4 columns rather, becomes 2 columns. And this also shrinks. We no longer see the text associated with these 2 pictures. We just see the image. Or actually, I stand corrected. We do see the text, but the text is underneath it as opposed to alongside of it. If we make it even smaller still, we're down to essentially 1 column with those 4 links in 1 column and our stories here in 1 column. So this is a page that will look reasonable on a large monitor or on a very narrow screen, such as a phone or a tablet. Now, we actually have some emulation built into Google Chrome that is useful in testing to see if a web page looks good under, on different platforms. So if you click on the 3 dots here and go to More Tools, Developers Tools, you can turn on Device Toolbar. And it will show you what the page looks like under different circumstances. So for example, on a Pixel 5, the page looks like this. There's some scrolling involved to be sure. On an iPad Air, it'll look like this. What would be a small one? It's like that. So this website looks reasonable no matter what device it's being viewed on. And that's a goal. Again, that's always been sort of a goal in web development, but the prevalence of mobile devices and using mobile devices to access websites makes it all the more important. And we can visit different websites to see how responsive they are, and the better ones will be responsive. Let's look up ESPN. All right, that's how it looks like in a wide browser window. As we narrow that, well, these scores up here eventually disappear, replaced by a link for scores that shows up vertically instead of horizontally. Remember, things don't need to look identical on all screen sizes, as that's not possible, but things should look good regardless of the screen size. And that's the idea of responsive web design, that things look good regardless of the size. Now, how do we achieve responsive design? Well, there's three key components to responsive design. And there's a link for it. Media queries. What is a media query? A media query is a directive within your CSS to specify under what circumstances a certain style rule takes effect. So, in this case, this rule here, where we have P, font size 1 EM, at media all, and max width 400 pixels. If the browser window is less than 400 pixels, the size will be 0.8 M, not 1 M. Let's see if we can find an example of a media query. Let's see if we can find other examples of a media query. W3 Schools is always a good one. All right. In this case, we have screens that are 992 pixels wide or less. The background color is blue. Screens that are 600 pixels or less. The background color is olive. So that is part of the CSS of this page. So as I make it smaller, bigger, it changes colors. Here's another very common technique that's done, the navigation bar. If the screen is a certain width, the navigation bar will be oriented horizontally. But if it gets below a certain size, the links will be displayed vertically. I think you can see how this would be beneficial in a mobile environment where you don't have as much scrolling, where scrolling side to side is undesirable. Scrolling vertically on a mobile device is kind of to be expected. We do that all the time. What we don't do, and what's sort of undesirable, is to scroll horizontally. This one shows how, depending on the size, we either get one column or multiple columns. We initialize set this. We set our rule for columns to have a width of 25%. And in fact, if this is big enough, this browser window, we can't make it that big. No, this monitor isn't big enough. It would make these things right next to each other, horizontally. If it's less than that, though, it will make it 50%. And if it is, the maximum width is 600, it will make it stacked vertically. So I'm actually going to put this on Canvas because these are some good examples for you to see. Let me go and add that to Canvas. We can specify individual pieces of a style sheet to have a media query, or we can specify entire style sheets to have a media query. So if we look for some more media query examples, we can put it on an element, or we can specify the whole style sheet. We had an example of that in CISS 216. Let me see if I can find that real quick. All right, if we look at the source of this and we make it smaller, we'll notice that the rules change at a certain point. If we look at the CSS for that, though, we'll notice that instead of putting the CSS on individual elements, I put it on the whole style sheet. So I create a link to the style sheet and have a media query to say that if the minimum width is this, so if the screen size is that much or bigger, it will use this style sheet. This is known as progressive enhancement. And in progressive enhancement, what you do is you can define a basic style that everyone's going to get, put that in main.css, and then you create a second style or a third style or a fourth style or whatever that will specify if the browser window meets these characteristics, then we apply this style sheet too. So it is possible to have two style sheets for the same page. And in which case, if there's anything in the second one that overrules the first one, you get what's in the second one. So if we look at these style sheets, we have our main CSS, and then we have our desktop CSS. Our main CSS has the body being yellow, the header being 90%, all these rules. But when the browser window is wide enough, this style sheet applies and it overrules. So the header now has a background of white and the opacity of 0.9 instead of what we defined in addition to what we've defined in the main style sheet. So media queries is one characteristic of responsive websites. A second thing that is a requirement or is a characteristic of responsive web design is gotta switch classes. Second characteristic of it is fluid grids. And again, instead of making something be a certain number of pixels, we make them a percentage width. And we do that in this example. I'm going to add this example as well to Canvas. We notice in these examples these sections on the page get bigger or smaller depending on the size of the things on the page. So when it's wide, it takes up more going across horizontally. As we narrow it, we get smaller and smaller and smaller. And we do that for the image as well. So we made our grids and images use percentages rather than absolute numbers. And if we were to look at the style sheet, we'll see that all my sections are defined. I'm using a grid layout, and each of the grid items is defined as being 20%, 30%, and 30%. So I'm using that variable grid size. And in addition, the image is defined as being a certain percentage of the page as well. With 100%. So as this guy gets smaller, the image is going to take up 100%, but that 100% is going to be smaller. All right. Now, this is not specifically client-side scripting. None of the examples that we looked at so far involve JavaScript. But I do think this is valuable as we're studying client-side scripting to review, because again, it is such an important concept. And although we talked about it in CISS232, I think it's important to revisit it just because it's so important. Now, there's a tool that helps you with this responsiveness. And this tool possibly has a little bit of JavaScript in it. But in addition, it is mainly done with CSS. And that tool is called Bootstrap. So I'm going to download that example, which I have posted. And Bootstrap is where we use sort of a pre-written, predefined CSS and make our classes of our elements match those that are predefined in the Bootstrap style sheets. So if we were to look at this, here's a page. Imagine this is the Zeller's Guide to Vacation Destinations. Home page, we have 4 columns and we have a footer. Now this is responsive because as we make the page smaller, those columns get smaller until a certain point. And at a certain point, instead of having 4 items going across, we have 1 item going across, and our links have changed to be horizontal instead of vertical. We look at the source code for this, we'll find that I don't really have any CSS of my own. I am instead using the Bootstrap CSS file. And we're specifically using Bootstrap 5.21. You'll notice with this, we can actually see what this file looks like. But it's not really going to be very useful to us because this is the minimized version of it. What do I mean by the minimized version of it? All the code in the CSS is smashed together, getting rid of any spaces. If we want actually a readable version of this, we have to get rid of the min. And there we can see all the stuff that makes up this CSS. Now, why do we use the min? Simply because it saves space. If you are a website that has heavy traffic, all those extra spaces add up to bandwidth on your server. And by eliminating all those spaces, it will save you quite a bit of bandwidth. It's just like if you look at Google's homepage, the source code for that, you'll see things are scrunched together. I spelled Google wrong. A lot of things are smashed together because that really just saves a lot of space. All right, let's look at more at the source code for this. Defined in the styleship are different classes. And I can apply those classes to different things. So for example, in this case, I've assigned to my header MT4, P5, BG primary, text white, and rounded. All right, what do all those things mean? Well, let's Google. A list of all the Bootstrap classes. So let's look, for example, what MT4 means. Not seeing that one on the list. Maybe this is a difference in the version. Let's look at BG primary. Adds a blue background color to an element, represents something important. So this is our header. That tells it what it means. So if I give it a style of BG primary, that's going to add a blue background to that element. So it makes a blue background to my header section. Text white obviously makes the text of that white. Rounded makes the element rounded. You can see a very small rounding of that there. The nice thing is all of these classes have been predefined by us, and we can use them and assemble them, and we get a web page that is responsive by doing this. We have our nav class. We have our nav element with a class of navbar, navbar expand, BG light. used to make the items with links inside a navigation bar. See all the styles that are available. So if we make nav bar right on this, I think this is looking at a different version. There's some CSS variables that we can set. And somewhere here it will show us the list of classes. There are Bootstrap themes that you can add. Make your page look a certain way. And so on. The idea behind this again, though, is that you have a consistent set of classes that you can use to make your page look a certain way. In this case, we have a fluid container. That's going to make it responsive. One of the rows of that, we have a column, small 3, BG primary. So it's going to try to put all 4 of these in a row. But if it gets to where there's not enough space, it will responsively put those, create another row. So as I get smaller here, at a certain point, it goes down to 1 column. All right, let's look at some examples in Bootstrap of how to do some certain things. I suggest you run through this Bootstrap tutorial. Here.
Hello, you beautiful people. In this tutorial, we're gonna cover the basics of Bootstrap.
This does a lot longer description and tutorial of Bootstrap that I'm going to do today. Remember, this being a blended class, you're responsible for doing things outside of the normal class in an online mode. Get started with Bootstrap. This walks you through how to do some things. And finally, How to style the nav bar. We can style the nav bar. If we do it this way, we can identify this nav as a nav bar and use the default, put it in a fluid container, and it's going to look like this. And as we make it smaller, it's going to make them stack vertically. This is indeed using a lot older version of Bootstrap, 3.41. We were looking at 5.2.1. How to make it inverted. If we give, instead of navbar default, navbar inverse, that will invert it. Make it right aligned. That bar constitutes to right align navigation bar buttons. Not seeing how that's right aligned, but okay. And so on. So go through that tutorial about navbar. And a very important one is the Bootstrap grid. You click on that, you can see how to make columns act dynamically and responsively. We have a container, we have rows, and we have different columns. Right, in this one, notice we have our div class row. Row means it's going to be side by side by default. Column SM6. Style background color yellow. That's one thing that you can do, by the way, if you want to override what Bootstrap does. You can add your own style to override it. So like by default, that's yellow. And we can make it a different color if we want. As the screen gets smaller, different breakpoints. So finally, at the small enough screen, it covers 100%. Nice thing about this tool in W3 Schools is you can change things and see how it looks. All right. In that case, giving a lower number makes a lower size. And you could do that if you had more things that you wanted to see together. Here, if you make them that big, right from the start, it makes them be stacked vertically. So this number indicates essentially the width, but it's like a relative width. It's not an absolute width. Last thing that I want to cover related to this is the Jumbotron. Jumbotron is kind of used for a header. And if you just assign a class of Jumbotron, it will make your header very, very large. simply by virtue of saying class equals Jumbotron. We do BG primary, as we've seen before. Anything. Again, I think there's some compatibility issues here between the different versions of this. Let me look more at my example. I have my section. SM3 is the width of that, color BG primary. And I have the 4 across. I have another section with the same thing, and there's also 4 across. And then finally, I have my footer. I've given an ID of credits. That ends up giving us this, which responsively goes like this. Now we can play with this to make it look other ways. For example, we could change these numbers to 8. That'll make it wider width, which means we might not get all 4 of them across on the same page. And sure enough, we don't. They go only, I did that to the second set of sections. So each one of these takes up more space, therefore I cannot put them side by side. If I put this number to 6, for example, makes them smaller. Change all of them to 6. Since it's 6, it can fit 2 of them side by side. Until it gets too small, then it puts them stacked on top of each other. My suggestion with all of these is to take what you have in my example and in W3 Schools examples and play with it to get it to work. Do, however, look for a reference for Bootstrap 5.2.1 to see. Let's see if I can find one with the last couple minutes of class. Oh, here's a nice one, Bootstrap, along with a demo of each of them. So if you want to see what column small is, you can click on this and it will show us a little demo of how that will be. All right, next week we will start talking about jQuery. We sort of had a false start about that last week, I believe, whereas this week we will start and we will cover that because that's also a very effective tool for us to use. All right, does anyone have any questions? If not, that's all I had for this week. We will see you either in lab or next week.